India fears no one, not even America. And I mean that with every ounce of weight those words carry. Because for too long, the world has been conditioned to believe that only a few nations hold the keys to power, that only a handful of countries decide the fate of everyone else, and the rest just have to fall in line. But let me tell you something right now. India has ripped that script apart. India has stood up tall, looked every so-called superpower in the eye and said, "We will not bow. We will not bend. We will not break." That's the fearless rise of a nation that knows its worth, a nation that finally decided it will never again play second fiddle in the orchestra of world power. You see, fear is a weapon. For centuries, the world's biggest players used it to keep others in check. Colonization built on fear, economic sanctions rooted in fear, military threats, nothing but fear dressed up in uniforms and tanks. But India, this is a country that has tasted fear, lived under its shadow, endured its weight, and then spit it out like poison. Because once you've known what it feels like to be chained, once you've fought for every inch of your dignity, you stop fearing those who only know how to flex muscles and wave their flags of dominance. India has learned the hard way that when you fear someone else, you're actually handing them power over you. And let me tell you right now, India has stopped handing out that power. There was a time when global leaders would expect India to seek their approval, to beg for their support, to wait for their validation. Those days are dead and gone. India doesn't walk into the room anymore hoping to be recognized. It walks in and changes the energy of the room. It doesn't wait for permission. It sets the terms. And that right there is why this fearless rise is terrifying some of the biggest players in the world. Because they're used to being the ones that others orbit around. They're used to calling the shots, but India flipped the game. India said, "We don't fear you. You will respect us." Now let's talk about America. For decades, America has been that one country everyone tiptoes around. You don't cross them, you don't challenge them, you don't outshine them. But here's the truth. India doesn't play that game anymore. And it's not arrogance, it's confidence. It's not about disrespecting America. It's about refusing to be intimidated by America. Because intimidation is only effective if you let it sit inside your head. And India has cleared that space. India has no room for fear because fear doesn't build futures. Courage does. Fear doesn't create leaders. Vision does. Fear doesn't inspire nations. Pride does. Let me tell you something about pride. Pride is not about chest thumping or empty words. Pride is about knowing where you came from, what you've overcome, and where you're going. India carries the pride of a civilization that has outlasted empires, that has been invaded, plundered, divided, and yet never destroyed. That kind of pride isn't built in decades, it's forged over thousands of years. And now that pride has taken the shape of a fearless rise, a rise that no one can deny. Not America, not Europe, not China, not anyone, because this is the power of a people who know that their destiny is theirs to own. Think about it. How many nations have the courage to stand up and say, "We will not be bullied"? How many nations can tell America, "You're not the standard anymore"? We are. Very few. But India is doing exactly that. When the West imposes conditions, India says, "Keep them, we're good." When global powers set the agenda, India walks in with its own list. When sanctions are threatened, India finds new markets, new partners, new alliances. That's the kind of boldness that makes the so-called mighty uncomfortable. Because here's the raw truth. A fearless India is harder to control, harder to predict, harder to silence. And what fuels this fearlessness? Let's break it down. First, it's self-reliance. India no longer wants to live on borrowed technology, borrowed narratives, borrowed approval. It's building its own. Missiles that can strike with precision, satellites that can map the universe, digital ecosystems that rival the biggest tech giants in the world, and an economy that refuses to be dragged down by global crisis. That's not luck. That's discipline. That's vision. That's a nation saying, we don't fear losing your support because we've built the tools to support ourselves. Second, it's unity. Yes, India is diverse. Yes, India is loud, messy, chaotic. But in that chaos, there's strength. In that diversity, there's resilience. Because while the world waits for India to fracture, India keeps finding ways to pull itself together. And nothing scares a global power more than 1 billion people moving in the same direction with the same determination. That kind of unity is a force you cannot bully. That kind of unity makes fear useless. Third, it's time. India knows it's no longer the India of yesterday. It's not the underdog anymore. It's not the student anymore. It's not the follower anymore. It's a leader, and leaders don't operate out of fear. Leaders operate out of clarity. India knows the 21st century doesn't belong to those who cling to old dominance. It belongs to those who create new possibilities. And that's exactly what India is doing. Creating, innovating, expanding, rewriting the rules. That's what makes the rise fearless. Because when you're writing the script, you don't worry about how others feel about it. Now, let me paint you this picture. Imagine sitting at a table where every other player expects you to just nod along. They talk, you listen. They decide, you obey. That's how the game was played for decades. But then India walks in. And India doesn't sit quietly. India doesn't just nod. India puts its hand on the table and says, here's how it's going to be. Do you know the shock that sends through the room? Do you know the discomfort it causes to nations that have never been challenged like that? That's exactly why this fearless rise is so powerful. Because fearlessness disrupts comfort. It challenges control. It demands respect. And this is what separates India today from India decades ago. Decades ago, India feared isolation. It feared being cut off from global markets, from global alliances, from global influence. Today, India knows isolation is a myth because the world needs India more than India needs the world. Need proof. Look at energy. Look at trade. Look at technology. Look at defense. There's not a single global challenge today that doesn't have India at the center of its solution. And that's the kind of position where fear has no seat. You see, when you're essential, you don't beg for acceptance. When you're essential, you don't fear rejection. When you're essential, you set the tone, and India has become essential. That's the silent truth that America and other powers have to swallow. They might not like it, but they can't ignore it. They might resist it, but they can't erase it. Because India has already carved out a space in the world that no one else can fill. And here's the real beauty of it. India's fearlessness doesn't come from trying to be someone else. It doesn't come from copying the West, imitating China, or begging for validation. It comes from being unapologetically itself, from holding on to its culture, its values, its identity while still mastering technology, industry, innovation, and power. That balance, that refusal to compromise who you are while still competing with the best, that's what makes India unique. That's what makes the rise fearless. But don't think for a second this rise has been easy. Fearlessness doesn't mean the absence of challenges. It means the refusal to be broken by them. India has had its share of setbacks, its share of doubts, its share of obstacles. But every single time, instead of collapsing, India recalibrated. Instead of bowing, India pushed back harder. Instead of shrinking, India expanded. And that resilience, that bounce back, that determination, that's the core of fearlessness. Now, let's get real. America, with all its power, has always had this underlying expectation that others will fear disappointing them, fear crossing them, fear defying them. But India doesn't buy into that anymore. India doesn't care about being on America's, good side. India cares about being on its own side. And when a nation chooses its own side first, when it prioritizes its own people first, when it stops fearing consequences and starts creating its own opportunities, that nation becomes unstoppable. Think about what it does to the global order when a country like India says, "We don't fear your tariffs. We don't fear your sanctions. We don't fear your disapproval." It shakes the foundation. It forces every other power to rethink how they engage, because suddenly intimidation loses its teeth. Suddenly, threats don't land. Suddenly, the usual playbook doesn't work. That's why this fearless rise isn't just about India. It's about a shift in global power dynamics. It's about proving that you don't have to fear giants to stand tall among them. And the truth is, fear is contagious, but so is fearlessness. India's rise is inspiring others. Countries that once bowed are starting to stand. Nations that once whispered are starting to speak. Regions that once felt invisible are realizing they don't have to play small anymore. That ripple effect. That's the true measure of India's impact. Because fearlessness, when demonstrated on the world stage, becomes a blueprint for everyone watching. And let's not get it twisted. This isn't about war, aggression, or domination. India's fearlessness isn't about trying to conquer anyone else. It's about refusing to be conquered, refusing to be silenced, refusing to be diminished. It's about walking into the world with dignity, with confidence, with purpose. It's about saying, "We belong here. We've earned this." We're not asking for a seat at the table. We're building our own. That's the fearless rise of India. Not a rise built on intimidation, but a rise built on inspiration. Not a rise that fears being challenged, but a rise that welcomes it. Not a rise that imitates others, but a rise that sets its own path. And the more this rise continues, the clearer it becomes that India fears no one, not even America. Because once you know your worth, once you've tasted freedom, once you've built your strength, fear loses all its power. And that's exactly where India stands today, unshaken, unafraid, and unstoppable. The fearless rise of India proves the future belongs to nations that know their worth, not to those that enforce fear. You see, for too long, the world believed that power was about how much fear you could instill in others. Nations built entire strategies around intimidation, sanctions, threats, and military posturing. They thought fear was the currency of influence. But what India is showing the world right now is something different, something much more powerful. Respect cannot be demanded by fear. It can only be earned through worth. And when a nation realizes its worth, when it stops begging to be accepted and instead stands firm on who it is, the entire balance of power begins to shift. India's rise isn't the product of fear. It's not driven by trying to dominate or suppress others. It's driven by a quiet, unshakable understanding of self. That understanding comes from history, from culture, from resilience, and from the realization that no nation should have to bend to survive. Fear enslaves, worth liberates. India is proving this every single day by standing tall without trying to intimidate others into bowing down. That's why this rise is fearless, because it's not dependent on fear tactics. It's rooted in self-worth. When you look at history, you see a pattern. Empire built on fear always collapse. They might dominate for a time, but they rot from within. Rome, the British Empire, colonial powers. They thrived on fear but couldn't sustain it because fear doesn't unite, it divides. Fear doesn't inspire loyalty, it breeds resentment. But nations built on worth, nations that know who they are and what they bring to the table, they endure. And that's why India's rise feels so different, so unstoppable. Because it isn't about scaring others into compliance, it's about commanding respect by being undeniable. What makes India fearless is that it doesn't need validation anymore. Validation used to be the trap. Smaller nations would seek approval from big powers, hoping for a seat at the table. They thought worth was something others had to give them. But India doesn't play that game anymore. India has realized that worth isn't given, it's claimed. And once you claim it, nobody can take it away. That's the shift the world is watching. India is not asking, it's asserting, not demanding through threats, but proving through results. Think about it. A nation that sends spacecraft to the moon and Mars on a fraction of the cost others spend. A nation that builds its own missile defense systems instead of buying secondhand tools. A nation that becomes the fastest growing major economy while the so-called giants stumble. That's not fear talking, that's worth proving itself on the world stage. That's India saying, we don't need to enforce fear to show our strength. Our results speak louder than your threats. And let me tell you, that kind of rise is far more powerful than any empire built on intimidation, because fear has an expiration date, but worth doesn't. Worth compounds, worth grows. Worth becomes the foundation on which generations stand, and India has tapped into that foundation like never before. You see, when a nation knows its worth, it moves differently. It negotiates differently. It walks into global summits with a different posture. It doesn't flinch when others threaten to walk away because it knows they'll be back. It doesn't panic when sanctions are whispered because it knows new doors will open. That's what happens when fear no longer dictates your choices. Your worth does. And India is embodying that truth right now. America and other global powers have always leaned on fear. They believed that being feared was the ultimate form of respect. But fear and respect are not the same. Fear fades the moment someone finds courage. Fear ends when alternatives appear. Respect, on the other hand, endures. And respect is exactly what India is cultivating. Because when the world looks at India, they don't see a bully, they see a builder. They see a country that invests in innovation, in development, in alliances not rooted in intimidation but in mutual benefit. That's why so many nations, quietly or openly, are gravitating toward India. Not because they fear it, but because they value it. This is the critical difference in how the future will be shaped. The future won't belong to nations that keep building bigger weapons just to keep others in line. The future will belong to nations that build trust, that create value, that show they are indispensable. India has positioned itself in exactly that way. It's indispensable in technology, indispensable in trade, indispensable in energy, indispensable in security, indispensable in culture. That's worth. And that's why the rise is fearless. Let's talk about the psychology of fear for a moment. Fear paralyzes. Fear keeps you small. Fear makes you compromise even when you know you deserve more. That's why for so many decades, smaller nations stayed silent. They were afraid of losing aid, losing trade, losing alliances. But what happens when a nation loses that fear? Suddenly, it starts to see the world differently. It starts to recognize that the very powers it feared need it just as much. And once that realization takes root, there's no going back. India has reached that realization. It knows that America, Europe, Russia, China, none of them can afford to ignore it anymore. That's not arrogance. That's worth recognized. And the most dangerous thing for powers that rely on fear is when their targets stop fearing them. Because then the whole system breaks down. That's why India's rise is shaking the old order to its core. Because if India can do it, if India can look America in the eye and say, we fear no one, then what stops others from doing the same? This is why India's rise isn't just about India. It's about rewriting the rules of global engagement. Nations that enforce fear often think they're secure. But deep down, they know the moment others stop being afraid, their control evaporates. India is proven exactly that. By being fearless, by standing on worth instead of fear, it is exposing the weakness of those who thought intimidation would last forever. And once exposed, they have no choice but to adapt. That's why you see America adjusting its tone, why you see Europe leaning in closer, why you see even rivals forced to respect India's stance. Fear no longer works, so respect becomes the only option. But let's not mistake fearlessness for recklessness. India isn't reckless, it's strategic, it's deliberate, it knows when to push, when to wait, when to speak, when to act. Fearlessness doesn't mean you pick fights just to prove you can. It means you refuse to back down when the fight comes to you. It means you're not bullied into silence. It means you don't trade your principles for temporary safety. That's the kind of fearlessness India embodies. And it's contagious. Other nations see it and they start asking themselves, if India can stand without fear, why can't we? That's how revolutions start, not with violence, but with shifts in mindset. India's rise is sparking that shift globally. It's showing the world that you don't need to enforce fear to be powerful. You just need to know your worth and live it boldly. The truth is, every nation has worth. Every nation has something unique to offer. But too many have been conditioned to believe that their worth only matters if the powerful recognize it. India is smashing that illusion. India is showing that worth is intrinsic. It doesn't need permission. It doesn't need validation. Once you know it, once you stand on it, the world has no choice but to acknowledge it. That's why the future belongs to nations like India, because the future won't be built on fear-based alliances that crumble at the first sign of courage. The future will be built on networks of nations that know their worth, that stand on it, that build from it. And India, with its fearless rise, is leading that movement. It's proven that the world doesn't have to be shaped by fear. It can be shaped by dignity, by pride, by respect. The fearless rise of India proves the future belongs to nations that know their worth, not to those that enforce fear.